Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again, and a few weeks back in one of the comments, one of you asked for a video on magical realism, and I, ever the man of the people, am going to give you one. This is the first video on my channel that is going to be sponsored by the good people at Skillshare, which is a website and a database of video classes and courses on all sorts of topics, from graphics to design, to writing, to life skills. I'll talk about that at the end of the video. Now, I am in no way an expert on magical realism, and this is not going to be a video about secondary sources, about academic discussions on the concept, about critical studies of it. I will leave some recommendations about that stuff, about books and studies by scholars who have studied the topic closely and that you can read if you're interested in it. But in the course of the video, I'm only going to discuss the topic very broadly, and I'm going to give you my interpretation of it and of why it is such a mess, but a very interesting mess to discuss. Hopefully, I will be able to touch upon some of the contradictions that make discussing literature so stimulating, but also so very problematic. I wanted to begin this video by giving you a very broad definition of magical realism to give a sense of what this thing, subgenre, this tendency even is to people who are not familiar with the term, who don't know what to expect when they hear it. The point is that it's impossible to give such a general definition because it's a very problematic concept. Some people will tell you that magical realism is just fantasy fiction written by Spanish-speaking writer. They say that because magical realism is very often associated with writers coming especially from Latin America, people such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Miguel Ángel Asturias, Isabel Allende. But that definition of fantasy from Spanish-speaking writers, well, that's completely, it messes the point majorly, and I'll tell you why in a second. Another very successful definition, possibly the most common, is that magical realism is a narrative genre where supernatural occurrences, inexplicable things, are described in a realist tone, but that too completely misses the point of it. So instead of giving you a very broad definition, what I'll do is, in the course of this video, I'm going to discuss many novels and short stories, and all of these are going to be awesome. Some of these are among my very favorite pieces of fiction. If you don't know what magical realism is, if you don't know what to expect, just check out these works. You are going to love them. I would recommend them to any reader, and there's a list. There's going to be a list in the description box of all the books and stories I mentioned in the video. Now, to me, the reason why magical realism isn't just fantasy from Spanish speakers is that magical realism is a tendency that relates to literary fiction and pertains to literary rather than to fantasy fiction. This is debatable, and some scholars, most notably James Wood, would disagree with me on this, but the way I see it, literary fiction is a fictional genre, every bit as fantasy, horror, science fiction, detective fiction, and so on and so forth. If you want a basic theory of how literary fiction is just like any other genre, a good essay you can read is Trickster in a Suit of Light by my good friend Micheal Chabon in the essay collection Maps and Legends. Now, many people hear literary fiction and they believe that is prize-winning fiction or good fiction, but that's not it at all. To me, literary fiction, once more it's worth repeating, is just a genre among many. But Bookchemist, why do you talk about genres? Aren't genres just something that booksellers use to put their books on their shelves so that I know when I want to buy a vampire novel what part of the bookstore I should hit and what part of it I should avoid? Aren't they just a commercial tool? Well, yes, and most definitely no. Genres do matter because every text comes with certain expectations, and it is a basic tenet of semiotics, which is the study of science and of the interpretation of science, most notably language, that when you access a text, when you decode the meaning of a given text, you do that by referring to your previous experience with other similar texts. The Role of the Reader by Umberto Eco, one of the foundational texts in modern semiotics tells you that no text is ever read independently. You always read every book in light of your experience with every other book you have ever read. In very simple terms, that is why when you pick up the manual to a piece of IKEA furniture, you don't read it from cover to cover and then go on Goodreads and write a very bad review saying, I didn't understand the plot, it was too experimental for me, and there's no need for IKEA to call you and say, but book chemist, you didn't get it, that wasn't a novel, it was a manual. You already know that that's a manual because you've experienced manuals before and you know how to interpret that. Similarly, when you read a horror story, say At the Mountains of Madness by my man H.P. Lovecraft, you don't go running through the streets screaming, there are monsters in Antarctica, watch out, because you know that what you've just read is fictional and is not supposed to scare you. Those monsters don't exist. But book chemist, you might be wondering, well, maybe I don't go running down the street screaming, but I'm still kind of scared by Lovecraft stories or by, I don't know, other horror stories. I know, right? That's not supposed to happen at all. Logically speaking, there are many explanations why that happens. Some of them have to do with structural reasons and aesthetic ones. Some have to do with the impact of empathy and theory of mind on the act of reading. I personally believe that has something to do with the power of language, with the very concrete and recognizable power that certain words have, and the way they influence our perception of reality and of ourselves. But that's a topic for a different video. If you guys are interested, let me know. Moving back to the subject of the video, genre matters because every literary genre brings along certain expectations. I'm going to simplify things in the most hideous ways, please forgive me, but say when you pick up a science fiction novel and from the cover, maybe from the synopsis on the back of the cover, maybe from the author's name who you recognize, you know that you're reading a science fiction story, you are going to expect spaceships maybe, or time travel, or aliens, or a variation of this. But that does not mean that the expectation of a specific genre are set in stone. Alistair Fowler, in what is one of the most seminal and relevant studies on genre kinds of literature, he says that it is the height of creation and of literary inventiveness to innovate and revolutionize the tropes, which are the expected features of any given genre. How do writers innovate on these tropes? How do they bring something new to the equation? I'll give you an example from the world of horror literature, of supernatural horror. A common trope in supernatural horror is the idea of the monster as an abomination, as the thing that should not be, a creature that contradicts the rules of society, subverts what is supposed to be normal, and threatens the normal and common order of things in a given setting, a given community. Dracula by Bram Stoker is a good example of that. You have a foreign monster that comes to London and preys on the good people of the city and has to be stopped. Another good example would be any of the alien invasion narratives from the golden age of science fiction. The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham, The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, which is a science fiction novel with borderline horror elements, if you ask me. That's the reason why Stephen King, horror master, famously said that horror is a rather conservative genre, because by discussing these things that should not be, these creatures and elements that break the rules of society, the genre is still reinforcing our beliefs about what is supposed to be acceptable in society, what is supposed to be normal, and what definitely isn't, and it's scary and should be stopped with fire. How do good horror writers break free of this conservatory trope? A good example comes from H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, which I mentioned before. There, it is not the monsters that constitute what breaks the rules of what's supposed to be normal, it's humanity itself that becomes the thing that should not be, that shouldn't even exist in the universe, where other entities completely alien to human civilization are instead supposed to be the norm and are instead the ruling forces. Another good example would be Stephen King's It. Possibly the most beautiful thing about It is that this monster that changes all the time it's not really an external force that intrudes upon the town of Derry. In what is definitely the most brilliant passage in the novel, it is kind of revealed that the monster, in a way, it is a manifestation of the many horrors of this small American town, of its prejudices, of its blindness, of all the fucked up things that go on behind its closed doors. And in that brilliant passage, it becomes very difficult to understand whether it, the monster, and the town of Derry even are separate things to begin with. Now, I have given you some examples of how great writers innovate on a specific trope, that of the thing that should not be from horror fiction, but know that every writer, every good writer at least, is going to innovate, to give a new spin to one, maybe a couple of tropes in whatever good story you are ever going to read. Why have I been discussing this idea that different genres follow different structures and have different expectation? Well, because the way I see it, and this is not set in stone, it's my view, the way I see it, magical realist narratives are literary narratives pertaining to literary fiction, and not to fantasy, and I'll tell you why in a second. They are literary narratives with maybe a dissonant note in them. Now, here's where things get complicated. Another major difference we should all be aware of, besides that between genres, is the difference in narrative fiction between realist fiction or mimetic fiction and non-realist fiction. Even more than the novel, the real king of today's literature is the realist novel, the realist work of fiction. I'm basing this wager on absolutely no physical data whatsoever, but if I am ready to bet that a good 95.5% of the books, of the fiction books that are written and published every year are going to be realist narratives. So, what's the difference between realist and non-realist narratives? Realist narratives give the reader the illusion that the story they're reading actually happened. They are set in worlds that might be very different from the one the reader inhabits, but these worlds still follow understandable rules of physics, of politics and foreign relationships between nations, and personal and social relationships between individuals. The human reactions of the characters are relatable. The way their psyche works and the psychological reactions of these characters make sense to the reader. Non-realist narratives give absolutely zero shit about all that. Believe it or not, much supernatural fiction is actually realist. In the case of certain genres like supernatural horror, realism is actually a necessity if you are to achieve that fear factor that is kind of a given of the genre. Fantasy novels too, such as Harry Potter, The Magicians by Leo Grossman, The Lord of the Rings, they are realist novels, set in worlds that are different from our own. Sure, magic exists in this world, but otherwise they are people by psychologically sound characters who behave in understandable and relatable ways. Sure, in Harry Potter magic exists, but let's take a pretty standard canonical realist novel such as Madame Bovary. In Madame Bovary there is also an impossibility. The fact that in that novel, in the world of Flaubert's novel, there once existed a woman in France called Emma Bovary who didn't really exist in the real world. Both of these novels present fictional elements. Magic exists, Emma Bovary exists, and both of these novels try to convince you, with different degrees of believability, that the things you read about actually happened. As long as you are immersed in the aesthetic experience of those novels, you are supposed to relate to these characters and to be able to people and inhabit their world. Non-mimetic novels throw everything in the air. A very good example of a non-mimetic novel would be The Hawkline Monster by Richard Brautigan, or even better, Brautigan's In Watermelon Sugar, where all sorts of absurd things happen. To give you an example, in the novel In Watermelon Sugar, a kid at one point speaks with two tigers who just ate his parents, and the tigers help him with his homework. In H.P. Lovecraft's Dream Quest of Unknown Cadet, a rather non-realist novel, you have a character being carried from the moon all the way to the Dreamlands by an army of cats. Very often in the course of that novel you're not quite sure what's going on, because the novel defies the bounds of realism, of what's supposed to be happening, and you don't really quite know how to imagine what's going on. Pynchon's fiction, if you follow my videos, I talk about him all the time. Very often Pynchon's fiction is difficult to understand. You don't quite get what goes on in certain chapters of Gravity's Rainbow because they break realism completely. Possibly the most famous example of a non-realist narrative in the English-speaking world, I don't know how it is in the US, but here in England people are obsessed with it, would be Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. But what about magical realism? Is magical realism even realism at all? You tell me. It seems to me that that's highly debatable. If you take the short stories of Julio Cortázar, one of the masters of magical realism, yeah, those stories do preserve the illusion of fictional immersion, they do preserve the realist element. In a short story called A House Taken Over, you have a couple of siblings, a brother and sister, who live in a house large parts of which have been occupied, have been taken over by mysterious forces that might be ghosts, might be monsters, might not even exist, and you're never quite sure what those are, and sure, that's tricky and it's difficult to imagine, but at the same time, the way the characters' reactions are portrayed, the way they behave, the context, the setting, are all sound enough to preserve the element of realism. The same happens with Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits. Sure, there are girls in that novel with green hair, but if I remember correctly, I read it a long time ago, otherwise the novel is very much a realist novel. Things start to get complicated when you take 100 Years of Solitude into the picture, and by the time we get to Kafka's The Metamorphosis, I am fully skeptical. Because to me it's very difficult to draw a line and to say that a kid speaking with tigers who just ate his parents, that's not realist and non-mimetic, whereas a father throwing an apple to his cockroach son is. Another point that is crucial to our discussion of magical realism is that the supernatural element in a magical realist short story or novel has to be subdued. It has to be almost ignored by the narrator and by the text, because the more time the text spends on its fantastical element, the closer it gets to the realm of fantasy. Fantasy fiction is basically fiction where the world works according to different laws of physics, of history, of whatever, than our own, and the text dedicates a certain amount of time to explaining in what ways the fictional world is different from the reality we know. That's the reason why, to me, Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie, I struggle to see that as a magical realist novel, because that text spends quite a long time talking about the peculiarities of all these magical children living in India. If you take a fantasy novel such as Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is so-called low fantasy, it's steeped in history, it's a very realist text, I struggle to see a strong difference in the way Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Midnight's Children handle their fantastical elements. Now, one thing you might naturally ask yourself when we discuss this kind of stuff is, what's the point of all this? Why do writers write magical realist texts? That's a very dangerous question, and it's one us critics, I myself as a student and scholar of literature, ask ourselves a little bit too often, because it's very easy to forget that literature really has no point. Just like life, literature just is. If it had a point, it wouldn't really be literature, it would be a political pamphlet or something of the sort, an IKEA manual or something like that. But I understand the question, and a possible explanation behind magical realism is given by Brian McHale. In Postmodernist fiction, he has a chapter on different various forms of magical realism, and he talks about 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, by saying that the peculiarity of Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude is that not only the fantasy elements in it are taken as normal by the characters. The fact that children ascend to the heavens, that's nothing too impressive. But also the other peculiarity is that otherwise common things are perceived as magical. Ice is perceived as an impossibility in the tropical climate of this novel. I remember that there are some characters at one point who are very shocked to discover that the earth is round, and there are some civilian massacres in the book which are dismissed as outlandish, as impossible. As you can easily see, one possible way magical realist changes the reader's perception of the world is to inform them that maybe some of the things we take for granted nowadays, some of the things we take to be part of reality and unchangeable, actually really aren't, and maybe that they are only part of our worldview, but that can change very easily if only we change our perception of things. Now, I'm going to wrap this thing up. I know it's a very general discussion, and one of its many flaws is that it takes magical realism as this monolithic thing, whereas it isn't. Magical realist novels have to be inserted in order to be fully understood in their own national literature. That old idea that magical realism is just fantasy fiction from Spanish speakers, while I disagree with it, it's not really as absurd as it sounds. It's true that Latin American magical realism is a tradition of its own, and that relates also to the idea of the Real Maravilloso as theorized by Alejandro Carpentier, and to the history of magical realism and to the evolution of the concept throughout the 20th century, but that's stuff for a different video. To conclude, my view of magical realism is as not so much a genre, but as a tendency that you can find in literary novels, where you find some supernatural elements that challenge the realism of the novel and introduce some counter-realist tendencies in it, but these are always subdued and they are always minor tendencies within the novel. To put it differently, if you think of a novel such as Kafka's The Metamorphosis, if you take the cockroach out of that novel, you shouldn't do that. That's perverted. Why would you do that? But if you tried this thought experiment, if you took the fantastical element out, say if you rewrote the novel and made it so that Sansa is in fact suffering, say, from an embarrassing speech impediment or a terrible skin rash, the novel wouldn't really be changed too much. That's the reason why this very straightforwardly metaphorical interpretation of the metamorphosis, of the turn into cockroach as some sort of nervous collapse, it's why that explanation is so successful, and for good reasons. It's a good way of interpreting the novel. Whereas try and imagine, Harry Potter without magic, it doesn't quite work, does it? And when you start considering magical realism as a tendency, you see it emerge in very unlikely places. To refer to my area of expertise, so-called, which is contemporary American fiction, possibly the most under-acknowledged magical realist novel of the last 20 years, not really, the last 30 years, would be Infinite Jest. David Foster Wallace's novel has floating people, and even the idea of the movie at the heart of the novel, of this lethal cartridge, that if you watch it, even just a second of it, you are completely absorbed by it, you can't stop watching it until you die. That idea to me, it kind of challenges my beliefs about how reality is supposed to work. I find it so much more counter-realist than, say, a spell in a Harry Potter novel, because in Harry Potter's world, spells, well, they exist. If you study at Hogwarts and places like that, and you are the right kind of person, you're a wizard, you can learn to cast them too. Whereas the Infinite Jest cartridge short-circuits the way reality is supposed to work in a much more disorienting way, and to me it feels very much like a magical realist element. Another text, the last one I'm going to discuss, that has some elements of magical realism is one of my very favorite novels, The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay by Micheal Chabon. This is widely considered a literary novel, a piece of literary fiction, but many people underestimate the fact that there are so many supernatural elements in here. There are quite a few ghosts, there's a house that is haunted by moths, ghosts, a guy that has visions, and so on and so forth. The reason why I don't think Cavalier and Clay is a magical realist novel is because of a sentence, my very favorite sentence from the novel, that you find very early in it. The protagonist, Joe Cavalier, is visiting his young brother. Joe is not supposed to be here, he's supposed to be somewhere else entirely, and he tells his young brother Thomas, just pretend I'm not here, pretend I'm a ghost. And the narrator informs us that Joe could not shake the feeling, reportedly common among ghosts, that it was not he, but those he haunted, whose lives were devoid of matter, sense, future. Which is a blood-chilling passage. It's one of my favorite from all of literature. And that sentence, he could not shake the feeling, reportedly common among ghosts. The fact that this is a novel, this is a world where ghosts work in a certain way, there are certain things that are common among ghosts, it inserts ghosts within a rational framework, and for that reason, this novel to me is not magical realism, but that sentence makes it fantasy, because the novel tries to explain to me the workings of a fantastical world. To me, Cavalier and Clay is a fantasy novel that poses very convincingly as literary fiction. Am I reading too much into that single sentence? Most likely. Thank you so much for watching this immense, no doubt, video. I really want to hear from you. I really want to know what your perspective on magical realism is, what's your perspective on some of the works I've mentioned and other works, famous works in magical realism. And I'd like to diffuse the comment that is going to come, they are going to come, those populist comments about the idea that why do we need these definitions at all? Why can't we just read books and enjoy them for what they are without worrying whether they're magical realism or not? Which is, to me, makes no sense, because the storytelling is so central to the way we think about the world and we construct our ideas about reality and about ourselves, and language is so fundamental to the way we construct reality and we think about everything, that it makes no sense for me to say that these things shouldn't be studied. And also very much more basically, because when I love something, a piece of art, a work of fiction, the tendency for me is not to just shut up about it, but it's I want to discuss it, and I want to talk about it, and to discuss everything about it. And so I'd love to discuss this stuff with you guys in the comment section below. Someone's playing music outside my window. Thank you so much to the good people at Skillshare for sponsoring these videos. Skillshare, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a website with a database of video courses and classes about all sorts of things. The reason why I decided to accept the sponsorship is because in the writing section I saw that some major league writers, including Roxane Gay and José Older, they offer classes on writing non-fiction, on writing stories, on Skillshare. Check out the description box for a link to get 2 months of free subscription, but even beyond those 2 months, Skillshare is very cheap. I will also post a link to a class I enjoyed a lot by José Older. One of the great things about writing classes on Skillshare is that there is a section. This is not just for writing classes, but it's particularly relevant for this kind of task. There's a section where you can post what you're working on. You can share maybe your short story with other students who are currently enrolled in the same class. You can comment on other people's stories, get their feedback. It has a very nice and very professional, very constructive vibe, and I highly recommend you check it out. Do check it out, it's amazing. If you want to maybe acquire some new skills, maybe you're applying for jobs, I know your pain, or maybe you want to improve your writing, or maybe you want to learn some new hobbies and crafts, or maybe you want to improve your business, there's something for you on Skillshare. Check out the website, it's really great. I honestly believe that. Thank you so much for watching the video. Bye guys.